My name's Phil Serene. I lead engineering at Game Changer. Um, and I'm going to talk about continuous delivery for iOS. Now, there's an asterisk next to that because I think what most people here probably know is you can't actually do continuous delivery for iOS. So I'm going to explain actually what I mean and explain what that asterisk is. So I'm going to tell you a little about what we do at Game Changer. Um, it'll help explain a little bit of what I'm talking about. We're a sports technology company. We're in Lower Manhattan, and we work on amateur sports. And basically, the way you can think of our product is um, amateur sports like baseball, softball, basketball. Those are the three sports that we work on. They 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 do they have somebody on the team or a coach or somebody who's doing record keeping in a paper scorebook. And it basically records everything that happens in the game. And then you go home after that, calculate statistics, partly for record keeping, partly to help with player development, partly for publicity. And that takes a couple hours. And well, along we came and said, well, take this free app, record essentially everything that happens in a basketball game or in a baseball game, and you can get free stats instantly. And so our customers love this. They ask us about 5 times how much it costs, and we tell them it's free, and they eventually believe us and they start using it, and it's great. And the way that we work as a business is that from here, essentially a bunch of data is getting uploaded to us, and we can generate a lot of great content from that. So people pay us $8 a month so they can get like a live stream of essentially a play-by-play of their kid's game if they missed it, or text message alerts when their kid does something interesting, or a computer-generated recap story, which is surprisingly awesome. So it's a fun thing to work on. And I'm going to talk particularly about our app and our release process. Now, normally at what's that? Huh? I come with my own laugh track, which is good. So I know there's some folks here who might actually not be familiar with the term continuous delivery, even though we are at the continuous delivery meetup. So what I'm talking about is commit code, it goes to production within minutes. That's the idea of continuous delivery. That's a great thing. You can't do that with iOS. But there's some great things that continuous delivery does that we want to do for iOS. In particular, it lowers risk, it lowers waste, and it decreases time to market. And so those are things we all like. And so we want to kind of take what happens in continuous delivery and make it happen in iOS. Now, Fred Wilson, a few years ago, continuous delivery, continuous deployment, sometimes called, got a lot of press, and Fred Wilson blogged about it. Said, big changes create big problems, little changes create little problems. I realized that this model, meaning continuous deployment, continuous delivery, doesn't work in desktop software and mobile apps. Well, I sort of disagree, even though I've conceded that you can't totally do this. But what I'm going to argue today is that the principles behind continuous delivery on the web are things that you can apply successfully to apps. So really what I'm going to talk about today is just a little bit of theory about kind of why this stuff works. I'm going to go through a case study at Game Changer and talk about how we solved, I guess a case study of a problem that we had at Game Changer. Talk about how we solved it. Maybe talk about how this generalizes for different environments, because not certainly the things that we did are not going to be exactly the things that other people are going to want to do. So as I said, what we want out of this is we want faster delivery. We want less waste, meaning wasting less time, wasting less money. We want less risk. I mean, both technical risk, your app dies and your customers are unhappy, and product risk, building something that people don't want or that doesn't kind of work right or feel right. And these things, whether you do them on the app or on the web, are great. So it's really important to get beyond kind of this to how this works. And continuous delivery works. I'm picking out 2 reasons that I think are important and that are applicable to mobile apps. One is small batches, and I'll talk about what I mean there. and one is fast feedback. So you can't do continuous production deploy, you can't do automatic monitoring, you can't do like fast cycle A/B tests. But these things, small batches and fast feedback, are things that you can do, and it turns out that they work. So what do I mean by small batches? So in Eric Ries blogs about this. Actually, he's quoting from the Lean Thinking book, so this is like a third-hand anecdote, but it makes sense. This is a picture of envelopes that are stuffed. So imagine people stuffing newsletters. Like, I don't know if people did this. I had to do this for my mom when I was a kid. I don't know if people still do this, but idea is you got a newsletter, you need to fold it, put it in an envelope, address it, and mail it. You need to do this like 100 times. So in the story, there's a father, and he's doing this with his daughters. And what the father is doing is he's taking these newsletters, folding them, stuffing them in an envelope, addressing them, stamping the envelope, and he's doing that one at a time. So he's essentially just packaging one envelope, putting it down, getting the next one, getting everything ready, putting it down. And his daughter's like, no, Dad, you're wrong. What you need to do is you need to fold like 25 newsletters, and then address 25 envelopes, and then stuff 25 envelopes, and then stamp them and address them and mail them in these batches. And it turns out that like the dad wins the race. And that's completely surprising and unintuitive to me, and I think to a lot of people. And the reason is, there are a couple of reasons. One is that you can undervalue the amount of time it takes to actually manage these big batches, like dealing with these big piles and moving them around and making sure they don't fall over and that kind of thing. Like, there's some effort in that that's easy to overlook. The other thing that's efficient and that's good about these small batches, that's bad about large batches, is like, well, what if you make a mistake? Like, and I'm positive I did this at my wedding because I did it the wrong way when I was addressing invitations at my wedding. But like, what if you write like the address is upside down on like 20 envelopes? Well, if you're doing it one at a time, you kind of realize that, well, your pile's the wrong way, and you fix it, and you've got only one wasted one. But if you're doing like 25 at a time, then, well, you've wasted a lot of time. So if you're in an environment where errors happen a lot, like our environments, then small batches are especially nice. So this is really counterintuitive. But I think everyone's observed that the software, generally in technology, we're moving towards small batches when it comes to release cycles. So, the 1 year release cycle, some people still do it. I mean, actually, Apple does it with iOS. But a lot of people are doing release cycles that are like a few minutes or a few hours long. And when we talk about continuous delivery, we're often talking about doing a few hours of work, committing it, and having it in production, or a few minutes of production. And it changes the way that people have to work. So if you're developing code that's going to go into production in a couple minutes, well, and you're trying consciously to keep your batch sizes down, it means that engineers need to think about keeping their check-ins small, which is kind of a hard thing to do. Like, sometimes it's nice to just put your headphones on and like stay there for like a day or two, go home and eat and whatnot. But just to concentrate. But like changing that to, well, I'm going to do really small commits, it's a mental shift. That's where feature flags get used. So you can do these small commits and hide things behind feature flags until they're ready. It means that when you do code review, you got to be really fast and responsive because you're in this like small commit mode. So get a conference room and get everyone together and project code reviews on a screen, which is kind of how they used to do it at the beginning of my career, which maybe makes me feel old. Your deploy process needs to be really good. It needs to be able to handle doing deploys like dozens of times a day, and it people struggle with this, but you do have less risk when you do something like this, because these small batches is kind of like what Fred Wilson was saying, small changes create small problems. Well, if you've got a really small batch, the chance something in it's going to go wrong is reasonably small because there's not a whole lot of stuff there to begin with. And it also means, of course, that fewer things, like if you do break something, you're building fewer things that are broken on top of your whatever bad assumptions or bad processes or bad machinery that caused your batch to spoil. But when I say that, I'm kind of making an assumption. And the assumption that I'm making is that you have fast feedback. And what I mean is that if you have a small batch, it only kind of really works if you know that your small batch works or it doesn't work. And that's, I think, why continuous deployment has worked really, really well on the web, because fast feedback is really, really easy. You've got automatic monitoring, you've got PagerDuty, you've got your graphs and your charts that update pretty instantly. So you can do these like small batches and know right away whether you've broken something most of the time and be pretty good. So I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk about now this small batch and fast feedback problem at Game Changer, and I'm going to use an example that we faced. So this is what this graph shows. Don't worry too much if you can't read the numbers. This is essentially the average time between submitting an app to Apple for review and the time that Apple authorizes you to release the app. And what this is basically saying, like here's like a little under 4 days, and here's like 8 days. So basically what it's saying is like 4 to 8 days. It's about how long it takes. That's not a small batch, right? The minimum batch of stuff that's going through Apple's process is going to be 4 to 8 days, and nobody even does it that small, because you probably would annoy your customers if you're giving them updates once a week. And then that means obviously your feedback isn't fast either, because you're going to wait 4 to 8 days to know whether what you're doing is actually working in the wild. So we had an idea a couple years ago when we started trying this out, and I think Chris Ricco, who's here actually, didn't know I was going to put him on the spot. I think he actually came up with this idea, which is like, why don't we just do this all, but before we submit to Apple? So what if we do this like kind of small batch fast feedback process right before it goes to Apple, and then we have to go through their standard process? So what that would mean is, this is kind of our build process, our deployment process for the app in a nutshell. Before we've submitted for review, well, on the top left is Jerry. He's one of our developers. He really likes baseball. He really likes iOS. It's no secret, no surprise that he works at Game Changer. And he commits like an hour's worth of code. That goes to Jenkins. That's the fellow in the middle, our build automation server. Jenkins creates a build, runs a bunch of tests, and then when that all passes, Jenkins goes, uploads it to Hockey App. So one of my colleagues looked at this slide and he says, Hockey App's logo looks like a toilet.
Jenkins puts it in the
Yeah,
toilet.
they're German. I don't know. Maybe it makes sense there. I'm not sure. And then what Hockey App does is it's like a beta distribution platform. So the idea is you when you send something to Hockey App, it basically all of these here internal company devices, iPhones, iPads, and then Hockey App makes the builds available for internal distribution, pretty much right away. So it means that within our company, we've got on approved devices, we've got our app deployed within minutes of it actually being checked in. So this is great. Well, this is continuous deployment on iOS, and we're done, and I'm going home. But not really. So the thing is that we still wanted to be really sure that when we submitted something to Apple that it actually worked, because we don't have it's going to take us 4 to 7 days to correct a mistake. So reasonably sensibly, we said, okay, we're going to put a period at the end. So we're going to have this period at the top. We call this the alpha period. And that's where, Jerry's doing his hour-long or few hours of check-ins and commits, and we're getting continuous deploys. And then we're going to have a code freeze, and then we're going to have a testing period, which we call our beta period. It's kind of an internal beta, really. And we're going to just do a bunch of testing during that week and make absolutely sure that what we have is great. And then we submit it to Apple. And this seems like a really good idea. It's basically continuous deployment with a little safety net, and then you send it out and it works, but it didn't work. And I'll talk about why it didn't work. And basically, we'd solve this batch size problem in theory, because we now are committing these small batches. But nobody actually used these. Like, we deployed these things to company devices. We don't score baseball games during the middle of the day in January in our jobs. Like, maybe if we were working at like Twitter, this actually would have just worked fine. But for us, like, we don't happen to score baseball games for fun as part of our natural, like, our daily life. So nobody uses this stuff. So what we thought was going to look like this, we kind of had this problem. Well, all the testing in our process happened here at the end. And this was bad. So what we have is, like, what we tend to do, the way we test is we've got, we right at the end, we have an app release candidate that's ready to go out. We run through a test plan on it, some manual, some automatic. And then when it passes, we ship. Well, if it fails, then we fix something, and we rerun the test plan. And if it fails, we do it again. And what was happening was we were doing like 5 to 10 turns of this process. So we would, we'd have a release candidate. We'd be really excited. Well, it would fail, and then someone would go fix something. And then we'd try again, and it would fail again because the fix broke something else. And we'd try again, and it would fail again. And it was, not good. Obviously wasteful, because essentially this week we were just felt like we were kind of wasting our time trying things over and over again, and sometimes it was more than a week. In terms of risk, it's kind of hard to visualize risk, especially when things are working. I'll attempt to do it here. This is a graph of crashes per session. It means essentially percentage of app sessions that end in a crash. So if you can't read these numbers, the top line is 4%, which is actually not a super high crash rate. Well, I have some apps on my phone that crash a lot more than 4% of the time. The middle line is 2%. And these horizontally, these are our app releases. So this is like a release that's about 2 years old, and here we're getting to just about a year ago. So this is the crash per session rate. And what we noticed here is we care about our crashes. Like, we don't want these to go up. But despite the fact that we were like trying to prevent crashes, like, our crash rate was kind of creeping upwards. And that kind of tells me that there was, that things were leaking through our process. We were taking risks. And we hit a crisis last year. What happened actually like a year ago this week was that we had, this is at this high point where we had about a 4% rate, which again is not like horrible. But the horrible thing was that what happened was that the people who hit these crashes couldn't recover from them. So we had some percentage of our customers, some large percentage of our customers who couldn't use the app. That flooded our customer service team. This also is right at the beginning of baseball season. So I know it seems ridiculous to play baseball right now because it's cold outside. There are like actually people in warm parts of the country who are playing baseball right now and are choosing tools they're going to use for the entire season. And so having this happen at the beginning of the season meant some impact to our business, that, basically, hey, you know what, this tool that I choose isn't working, so maybe I'll go use something else. So it meant something. We expedited a release. We got it fixed, but we did some damage. And so basically this idea, which is a good one, of this continuous pre-production deployment, didn't, and followed by this testing like overlap at the end, it didn't work well enough. And, because we had some waste and we had some risks that we needed to get rid of. So I'll talk about how we kind of got through that. So there are really two ways that we considered for kind of how do we kind of get this feedback problem under control. All of our testing was happening here. And that was creating a bunch of risk for us. So one thing we said was, well, we could just add a bunch of padding. And we actually kind of had to do this for a bit while we were just kind of getting things sane again. Like, we could just take more time and test more and make everything better. Padding kind of sucks, though. It's like a way of surrendering to a inefficient process. It's a way of like institutionalizing the slow feedback problem we had, institutionalizing like a kind of de facto big batch size that we had. I kind of view padding as like, management's way of encouraging waste. So we had to do this for a bit, but we didn't really like it. What we really wanted to do was say, okay, let's make feedback happen faster. Let's make the testing happen sooner. And then the only question is, how do you do that? Well, I mean, there's some obvious things here. So obviously we're gonna beef up automation, because automation can give us some feedback in terms of unit testing. We have a little bit of Appium testing. I took the screenshot yesterday. The red thing is green now, so I still have credibility. There were, we improved our unit test count by, I think we were probably 10 or 15x improvement in terms of unit test count. So this is important. I don't think this is really the interesting part. I mean, people do unit tests, but it's not, this alone wouldn't give me a lot of confidence in terms of releasing our app. Really what it came down to was, well, let's generate more feedback with these builds that we got. We've got this continuous build thing that goes and puts builds on people's phones. Now let's use it. So how are we going to do that? These are people. Like, these are 6 people. I know. This is the continuous delivery meetup, not the SharePoint meetup. So I'm not like, I might have just jumped the shark by showing pictures of people. Especially, like two meetups ago, the guy was like, hey, you know what? Like, don't buy tools. And everyone went nuts on him. And now I'm like, well, don't use people, or do use people. People are going to think I'm crazy. Now, I don't mean that we went on a hiring spree. Like, all these guys actually already worked with us. These folks, we said, you know what? Like, these are contractors on the customer service team on the right hand side. And we said, spend an extra 3 hours a week. We'll kind of tell you what to do. Person on top left is a full-time tester. Person here came on from the customer service team as a half-time tester, and then this person in the tire here is a designer, which you could probably derive from first principles. But so what I'm going to do is really talk about kind of how these people kind of helped us generate feedback in a really systematic, repeatable, disciplined way. So in order to distribute builds regularly to people who would use them, we needed to make our tooling a little bit better. We made our build scripts better. We rewrote them. We took our build server, moved it to Max Stadium, which is essentially just Max in the cloud with a fast connection. Basically took Time Warner Cable out of our out of the critical path of our release cycle, which is great. We have automatic release notes now. So that whenever one of these testers gets a new build, they see release notes. And then this thing, which ought to be trivial, but it kind of isn't, because Apple makes some things really hard on you. We made it possible to install our alpha builds, our beta builds, and our production builds on the same device. It's just a bunch of hackery and stuff, but it took us a while to figure out how to do that. So yeah, we improved our tooling. And then we kind of just went really old school. This is a checklist. These are people's names at the top of the checklist. These are them checking that they actually tested things. We had automated tests. As I said, we did some automation, but there were a lot of things, especially for an app like ours with really high usability demands, really high and the reason why, if you can think of kind of keeping up with a game at game speed under the kind of stress you're under when, someone takes a shot, misses, rebound, takes another shot, misses, takes another shot, is fouled, and that happens in the span of 1.5 seconds, and you need to record all of it. I'm not confident releasing unless I have people trying these things, and none of us are. So, but in other respects, this was a lot like kind of a build process that we're used to. Well, if these guys who are now sweeping through 3 times a week and running through their test list. If they find anything, then somebody jumps on it right away, as if like the build went red. Now, this also forced us to do some feature flagging because we're now committing in small increments. And, we've got people who need to be able to test the app all the time. And so, or, at least 3 times a week. So if we had a feature that's not yet baked enough to be tested, like 2 developers might be working on it simultaneously, but it's not ready for these guys, well, we feature flag it until it's ready and turn it on kind of at its earliest point that we can. So another thing we did, also involving people, was we made usability testing happen on a regular, frequent schedule. So twice a week. So this is our basketball interface. We redesigned our basketball interface. We launched basketball last year. We learned a bunch of stuff from it. And then we decided that we were going to revamp how it worked. And so we were usability testing our changes twice a week. So what's showing here is the foul flow. So when somebody fouls another player in basketball. So we had a version of this that we designed, we liked. We went out, we tested it, we hated it. And so then we did this like 3 or 4 times. We had something that passed testing that we felt was good enough. And the really cool thing about this was kind of the team dynamic that it created, because the designer, we're a 30-person company, 10 people on our engineering team, 3 people on our design team. Great ratio. We all sit right next to each other. So in stand-ups every morning, it would basically be a designer would say, hey, I'm going out tonight to test our app at West 4th Street basketball courts. And, I know you guys are working on the foul flow. Can I have something to work on? And, people would kind of talk and say, well, no, initially I wasn't planning on doing that. But, yeah, I'll reorder what I'm doing so I can get you something that you can test right away. So, they go out, they test, come back, say, hey, here's what I learned. This kind of sucks. We kind of regroup. We figure out how it's going to work. So it created like this really good dynamic. And, as an engineering team, we were really excited because we had really fast feedback on like whether our stuff was actually working. And the designers liked it too because, they could actually have input and see it build within a few hours. So that was great. So this is good, right? We're taking this testing now and we're moving it from here to here. And so things should get better, right? And it didn't really get better. And we hadn't quite figured it out yet. So this is, again, the number of beta builds. I don't think I've shown this before. This is the number of beta builds. So it's a number of turns of our beta testing cycle we're doing at the end of every release. This top line is the number 10, which is 10 beta builds, which means we're essentially repeating our process about 10 times. And the middle is 5. And what we're basically seeing is, except for this one outlier, for every release, we were doing like 5 or more turns of this like beta process, which is kind of expensive and kind of a waste of time. And we're just kind of waiting, like ideally, we freeze, we test it once and we submit it. And we don't waste any time, and instead we're doing this like 5 times. So it didn't work, and that kind of stunk, and it took us a while to figure out what was going on. So we have here is on the left is Eric, who's our tester, and Lena, who's his assistant, and Eric is actually, he tells me, he is actually testing our app in this photo, which is awesome. So Eric's job is kind of cool. Like he has both responsibility and authority for shipping a good app, which means he's the guy who presses the button for our app to go to Apple, and then presses the button again when the app is approved so that the universe can download it and start using it. And his mandate is pretty much, you don't press the button until you're confident. And Eric takes that incredibly seriously, and that's great. We realized that we had we ended up figuring out we had a problem with visibility because Eric doesn't brag a lot, which is good. He what he would do was just before he would go and submit the app to Apple, he'd go look in Trello, which is where we do our project management. He'd look at all the stuff we'd done for a release, and he'd dig through it, and he would just crazy test everything in there, and then he'd always find some kind of miracle bug right at the end where we're like, oh my God, Eric, like, thank goodness you found that, because otherwise, like, we would have died. And so we give each other a bunch of high fives and everything. And this process repeats a couple times. And this is great. Like, Eric was like a game changer. We talk about like being a good teammate. Like, Eric was being a great teammate. He was like helping us out. He was going in and figuring out what he needed to do to be confident in shipping. The only problem was that we actually didn't know he was doing this because he was a nice guy. So when we realized that this was what was happening, that Eric was kind of stuck in this last week, there was this hidden part of our process that we actually didn't know about. And, well, obviously, we just need to move Eric and Lena a little bit earlier in the process. And so, okay, great. Now we know what the problem is. So we, let's make it visible, though. Let's have a column in Trello that just says, hey, when something needs to get, when it's on Eric's list of stuff to look at, we'll keep it in a separate column and we'll move it to done as soon as it's done. And, well, this is great, but it was too much work and it started to pile up. And, well, then Joe showed up. Joe's this guy here, and we're like, hey, Joe, you're a customer service guy. If you spend like kind of half your time working with us, we can probably save you enough time in customer service that it's, worth your time. Joe was like, hey, sure, okay. So Joe came on board full time, and what we saw was, this is our beta build graph again. So again, the top line is 10 turns of the beta testing cycle, and this middle line is 5. So when we started tracking testing, we had like one more release around here, and then we started like getting a lot faster at shipping stuff. And so this is basically between 1 and 3 turns of beta. It could be dumb luck. I mean, this is only 5 times in a row, so there, we could have just been lucky a few times. I don't think it was. I also am still like, I'm not going to be here and say like having to repeat the same process 3 times is wonderful. I think this is actually a case where automation is going to help us get better. There are some legacy parts of our app that are not automated, that for which testing is not automated, and they're not written in a well testable way. And actually, we have a team that is forming around doing just that, probably within the next month or so. So I think that like to kind of get from this, like we got from like 5 to 10 down to 1 to 3, which is great. To get that next step, I think we're going to have to automate some of the harder to test aspects of the system. But the cool thing was that, like, kind of a more concrete way of saying it was that we don't really talk about testing week anymore. It kind of is only a couple days, because it doesn't take 5 days to do just a couple turns of our cycle. So that's good. The other thing that happened was crash rate. So this again is number of percent of sessions that end in a crash. We kind of got back down to here and lower than where we'd even been previously. About a third to a tenth of where we were at our like kind of at our, depending on where you measure, like, whether you measure from our worst point or our average point. But we got a lot better. So this is progress. Like we in terms of fast delivery, I kind of didn't talk a lot about fast delivery. We've been shipping every 3 weeks pretty much. I think our average has gone from like 23 to 21 days. We could make it faster. This is still probably about as fast as any iOS app ships. We did reduce waste though. I mean, we cut the amount of turns of that beta cycle. We reduce risk. Our crash rate is lower, and we just generally are more confident that we're catching things in our testing cycle. And we even had some kind of cool side effects, like our now that we've got these builds that are being regularly generated and people are regularly using them, and we have the tools to distribute them. Well, like one of the guys on our marketing team just started demoing our alphas to customers, and so my initial reaction to this was like terror, like, oh my God, what are you doing? And then I was like, wait, you're giving us more feedback. That's great. Like, you just kind of realized that all these features that he wanted to show off to convince people to use Game Changer were pre-release, And he had enough confidence in us that he would show them, and we were happy because if anything broke, he'd tell us about it. So it was kind of cool, kind of a neat side effect. So in terms of how this applies in your environment and in environments that aren't like ours, so this is where we started. Fred Wilson saying big changes create big problems, little changes create little problems, and the model doesn't work for desktop software and mobile apps. Well, the little change model works great. It works great for us in mobile apps. It just looks different. And if we're talking about like by the book continuous delivery versus what we did, I mean, automation versus some manualness, large sample A/B testing versus like usability testing, this isn't really the important part, right? Like what we did to make this fast feedback happen it's not that important. What is important is this idea of small batches, like getting our batches down really small. We figured out the ways to do that worked with us, which had to do with these like, distribution through Hockey App. And then we figured out how to solve this problem, which is getting feedback to happen really quickly. How you make this happen isn't that important. Like if you're doing enterprise apps, it's going to be different than if you're doing ours, or if you've got an app that your employees tend to use versus one that your employees don't tend to use, it's going to be different. Our techniques were like ancient, right? I mean, usability testing, manual QA. The cool thing we did with them was we just made them happen very quickly in very small batches, made feedback happen really fast. That's it. Well, thank you. And I'd love to take maybe a couple of questions if people have them. Yeah.
Instead of manual testing, at my company, for our website, we use something called Casper.js, which will actually load up our website and click buttons for us, so we can write tests like, go and click this button, make sure this happens. Is there something like that for iOS that can launch up a simulator and click the buttons for you so you don't have to like human do it?
Yeah, so the question was, on the web, his company uses something called Casper.js, which essentially simulates button clicks and verifies behavior of the website end to end. And is there a tool for doing that for apps? So there are a few tools. We use a tool called Appium, which is it's basically Selenium for apps. Like essentially your client code speaks the Selenium protocol, and on the back end is this massive hack that goes and drives an iOS simulator. And our experience with it has been up and down. We do use it, and we do have some automation around it, but we're not like kind of heavily invested in it yet. Next question. Oh.
Hi. On the separate alpha, beta
So the answer on server is by default, alpha, beta, and production builds all run against our production server. There are tricks you can use to get them to run against other environments, but by default, they run on the production server. Your second question was on how do we get them to run separately, and I'm forgetting. I think it was bundle identifiers. It was basically we just went to info.plist and hacked the hell out of it until we have a script that just goes and hacks it, switches out an ID so that we can separately install apps. Oh, got it.
Yeah, earlier you mentioned that you use Jenkins. Do you still use that, or do you use BuildBots and Xcode 5 on your cloud service?
Question was whether we use Jenkins or BuildBot. So we still use Jenkins. I'm reasonably happy with Jenkins. We use a little bit of Travis CI for some of our open source libraries. I don't have enough experience with BuildBots to really say a lot about them. I like the flexibility that Jenkins has to kind of do whatever it does in its own kind of plodding, frustrating way. And also, so yeah, I don't know enough about BuildBots to really say. Yeah.
I have a question. You mentioned it seems like you guys were relying a lot on manual testing. How do you manage the balance between manually verifying that new functionality behaves the way it should and that it doesn't cause regressions? Because I'm assuming that as you progress, your regression test suite gets larger and larger, and you only have so many testers.
It's a good question. We are simultaneous. I mentioned like our automated count went up about 10 or 15x. So my vision for how manual testing is going to work is that as our automation gets better, our manual testers are able to get more anal. But ultimately, we're basically like have a time limit on the amount of time that we're going to spend on manual on especially on like the regression testing part of manual testing. So we're putting pressure on ourselves to automate the things that can be well automated. Still though, when we build, so that's for regression testing. Still, as we build new features, I think I really want to have like some gameplay experience as part of testing new features to make sure we have confidence. That's kind of a half answer. I mean, we're pushing hard on automation, but we know that manual testing is going to remain part of our process. Yeah. Oh, okay. We got.
Hi.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
You mentioned an anecdote about usability testing, where one of your colleagues goes down to 4th Street, West 4th, to test out the app. Is that how you guys today still do usability testing? Like, is that standard example? And I guess the reason I'm asking is I found it odd that he had to leave to go do usability testing, because I could have thought he'd just fire up YouTube clip or whatever of some game in the past, and there's tons of testing scenarios that already exist. He doesn't have to
We've done both.
go to West
be
4th and
honest.
hope that like these scenarios work out.
Yeah, we've done both, to be honest. There's a certain advantage to being in the chaos of an environment that like simulates the amount of stress you can be under while scorekeeping. We also do a ton of testing with like YouTube clips or like games, and we sometimes we'll just like kind of go through a ESPN Gamecast of a game that was like scored a year ago, and for some reason, like Eric always picks games that my teams lose and makes me test them. But yeah, we do a mixture of both of those things.
Hey, got a few questions. So first, OK app, does it require users to install the app manually, or does it automatically install the new versions?
For new versions, what it does is when you launch the app, it will check with Hockey App, and you get a little pop-up saying, hey, there's a new alpha release available, and here are the release notes for it. Would you like to download it?
OK, then next, when you're working on a release and you're in the beta phase, do your main developers still work on master, or do you cut a release branch? How do you
We
handle
cut a
both?
release branch when we go to beta.
OK. And lastly, for your CI machines, you mentioned Max Stadium. Is that where you run all your builds and your IPM tests?
Yes.
OK.
So you say you get a release out to Apple roughly once every 3 weeks, right? Is that how, and Apple reviews those regularly, and in the end, users see a new version about every 3 weeks?
Yes. Basically what happens, you give it to Apple, and then their review process is basically a black box. You get some status updates that are meaningless, and then a few days later they say, hey, your app is ready for sale.
What's the highest number, or the highest rate of builds you could conceivably release to Apple that they would tolerate? Could you release to them daily and they'd be okay with that, or would they?
You can't have two builds in the pipeline at the same time, so we could release to them probably once a week and we would probably get away with it.
All right, thanks.
Where they get what they've told us is we get in trouble if we release if we release a lot of bad builds to them and they have to go and do crazy things to expedite releases, and that's when they start penalizing us. At least that's what they've told us. But I haven't personally tried to go and pump builds to them every week, and so they haven't pushed back on us yet.
There's also some negative pressure because of reviews. Your reviews refresh every release.
That's a good point. Actually, people didn't hear that. Your reviews refresh every release. So let's say that if you got a 5-star app and you push a new release, the default view in Apple shows reviews for the current release, and so you suddenly have a unreviewed app. It's kind of sucks.
Push on Apple and we'll change that.
I've got a couple questions down here. Let's see, the microphones are.
So I understand that running functional tests with Appium can be pretty challenging and not stable, but it seems like it can have a lot of benefits to cover a lot of devices and OS versions. What was the pushback against to favor more manual testing versus automatic testing?
I mean, to give you an example of a bug that we found in manual testing, which I think is fairly common, or a fairly common concern that we have. You're swiping the court to change possession during basketball. We had a case where the court would hiccup while you were swiping. That kind of doesn't seem like a big deal until, again, you're watching a basketball game and trying to record a change of possession and whoop, everything goes nuts. And there was a performance problem deep in our statistics code that would find that kind of thing. There are a bunch of interaction level things that are that only people are going to be able to find in an app like the one that we release. Now, it doesn't mean that I don't want to use Appium. We use Appium. It's just I want to use Appium at things that Appium is good at. Yep.
So it seems like you have kind of an inner loop of feedback and then a bigger loop of feedback for the things that you do release. But that feedback, by the time you get that, you're already a couple of inner loops beyond. How do you manage those different cycles?
That's a really good question. I would say that we don't have a formal process around that. We do keep an eye on, so it's like one example of that feedback is crash rate. So we do, because we have a pretty small team, we just kind of regularly keep an eye on kind of how the outer loop of feedback is working with crash rates in the wild. And then we see what's actually happening and we bring it back in. But right now it's kind of a very informal social process. We haven't systematized that outer loop feedback back into the inner loop. We also have a customer service team that is, seeing the outer loop and is sending cases to us. And so sometimes we get outer loop feedback come to us enough times that we're like, uh-oh, we need to do something about this.
Have you ever tried baking any instruments checks in your automated builds, like the memory leaks, let it bake for a while and run interactions on it, stuff like that, and then get some logs and automate that?
That's a good idea, and we haven't done that yet. We are running Clang in our automatic builds, like static analysis, but we aren't yet doing instruments checks. And I actually don't know what the issues we'd run into with that are, but it's something we should investigate. Cool, great. Well, thank you guys.